Welcome to the Artist Talk Discovering Comics with artist Napatsi Folger, which is presented in the context of the exhibition Pudlo Pudlat, Above the Limits. I would like to thank Napatsi for accepting our invitation to give the conference this evening. We're so glad that you can all join us tonight to this event. I would like to start by recognizing that La Guilde celebrates the cultural traditions and creative expressions of all Indigenous peoples of Canada and artists of fine crafts. La Guilde is situated on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawk Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters of Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. La Guilde respects the past, present, and future connections with all Indigenous and diverse communities of Canada. My name is Marie-Hélène No. I am the Cultural Activities Coordinator at La Guilde, and I will be your host this evening. Before starting the conference, I will give a brief presentation of La Guilde for those who are not familiar with us. La Guilde is a non-profit organization that aims to preserve, promote, and increase awareness of Inuit art, First Nation, and fine craft from Canada. La Guilde was founded in 1906 by two women from the English community of Montreal, Alice Peck and Amy Phillips. In 1949, La Guilde was the first organization to start the Inuit art market. Inuit art is a major part of our collection at La Guilde. La Guilde has a center of documentation and archives available for consultation as well. We organize temporary exhibitions, cultural activities related to our programming. La Guilde also has an art gallery, which brings together the work of established and emerging artists. For more information about La Guilde or about the works in the gallery available for acquisition, its temporary exhibitions, and its activities, I invite you to visit our website, laguilde.com. La Guilde currently presents the exhibition Pudlo Pudlat, Above the Limits, created in collaboration with the consultant Nak Alariak and in partnership with Inuit Futures in Arts Leadership. La Guilde also presents the second installment yes, of the pop-up series Horizon, an exhibition focused exclusively on Inuit art. It will be presented until June 6th, followed by the third installment of the pop-up series Conversation, an exhibition in partnership with the Centre des Métiers du Cuir de Montréal and the Centre des Textiles Contemporains de Montréal. In the context of the exhibition Horizon, Eldred Allen will be giving the artist talk Accidental Photographer on May 27th at 6 p.m. You can find more about the upcoming activities on La Guilde's Facebook page or on our website. This evening, Napatsi Folger will introduce us to her background and explain the development of her personal and unique style in comics. She will introduce us to the artists who have inspired her, as well as the way she draws from everyday life for rich subjects that deal with real issues. She will also present the comic strip she created on the work of Pudlo Pudlat. A question period will conclude the talk, during which you will learn more about her practice. Thus, I invite you to think about your question and to write them in the chat below during the talk. Napatsi Folger is an Inuk comic artist, fiction, nonfiction, and children's literature writer from Iqaluit, Nunavut. She now lives in Vancouver, BC, where she attended UBC to complete an MFA in the creative writing program. Folger is a contributing editor to the Inuit Art Quarterly, where her comics were featured as a limited series in 2020. Folger also has an upcoming comic in the 2020 spring issue of Carousel. Folger's written work has appeared in Walrus Magazine, Fruiten Magazine, Matrix Magazine, Taddy Creek, Town Crier, and Word Art. Her first book, Joy of Apex, was published by Inhabit Media in 2011. If you ever meet Napatsi and she looks spaced out, She probably is imagining you as a stick figure. Without further delay, I am glad to introduce artist Napatsi Folger.
Thank you so much. I just want to acknowledge also that I'm in North Vancouver, so I want to acknowledge the Coast Salish people whose traditional unceded territory on which North Vancouver resides, and a special thank you to the Squamish Nation. So I guess I will talk about myself. I want to say hello quickly to my nieces who are also on here with my sister. Hi, Viola and Mimi and Laura and Nick. So if you want to pull up the presentation, Marie-Hélène?
Definitely.
I'm going to start by talking about, I guess, my previous work and work that I've done for comics during my MFA. I've always sort of drawn comics, I guess. I never thought of myself as a comic artist until quite recently. I was a writer for a long time. I still am. My MFA is in creative writing. I just completed my thesis last week. And if you'll go to the next slide, and the next one. This, so I've always done stick drawings, well, since I can remember, drawing just little pictures for my friends, not necessarily comics, but this is an example of work I did for my first comics class I ever took, which was for the MFA program in 2 years ago. And we had one rule in the class, and that was, if you talk badly about your work, you have to draw a picture of a baby animal and put it in baby animal jail. So on the left here of this slide, you can see my baby rattlesnake, because I was talking about how crummy my stick people were, and I got in trouble. So this little snake is in baby animal jail in my old professor's office somewhere. And then on the right of the panel is a short little comic that I did. We did a lot of, one of my favorite things about comics is that you can just do anything you want. And the best way to practice is to just do quick sketches and things that you're doing day to day. So we would do daily comics, and this is an example of one of the practice assignments I was given. It was say one sentence about yourself, but draw it in a comic form. And so I think he said 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, so he said choose 6 words that describe yourself and then draw a comic about it. So here's me. This was in the height of, we had just been sent away from school because of COVID last year. So we had the last 2 weeks of class was online, and I wasn't doing much besides, staying up all night, doing schoolwork, getting up, trying to get the grog out of my head and get back to work for school. So you can see that this is a pretty simple comic. It's just me getting out of bed, messy hair, checking the fridge, looking for coffee, and thinking about things I could write about. So you can basically do anything simple like this and call yourself a comic artist, apparently. If you switch the next slide, please. This is another example of the kind of things that I did in school and that I do just to practice my comics anytime. You can pick anything. You can do more creative stuff. It doesn't have to be nonfiction. For this assignment, we did a comic every day for reading week. So we did 7 comics, and here's 2 of mine. And these were I obviously like to sleep in, as you can see from my last comic and this comic having me kind of rumpled and tired. But this was an early days kind of practice for me. So you can see that there's no space between my panels. And it's really simple stick drawings. There's no toes on my characters. So it's nice to be able to do this kind of thing where you just draw whatever you're doing for the day and practice your craft. And so here, these are two things that I liked, these two of my whole collection of the 7 days, because they're funny and I think a lot of people can relate to them. So this is the kind of comic that I started out doing. And once we get into the next few slides, you'll see how my work has evolved. You can switch slides. Here's another example of, this isn't for school, but while I was doing my thesis, I got, it was stressful, and I was doing painting in watercolor. So just to take a break, but to keep my creative juices flowing, I would draw just little really fast crummy comics like this on index cards. So this one, I think it took me 5 minutes, but I had been scrolling on Facebook and looking at all the cute little dogs on Facebook, and I thought it would make a funny comic to show what your online presence might be like compared to what your real life reactions to things are. So if you flip to the next slide, here's another one that I made for my sister, because I get a lot of pictures of my nieces and they're adorable. So I thought I would show her how I feel about all of the pictures in this little comic, which is also on an index card, and also took me 5 minutes or a couple of minutes to do. So I think these last few slides that I've showed you, it's really important to do this kind of thing where I obviously wouldn't publish this professionally or send it out to a magazine, but it's good to practice every day and to just have fun with it. Like I said, these are comics I made on my breaks from grueling work, because comic making can be quite difficult mentally. It's time consuming, and depending on your subject matter, it can be quite stressful. But these are examples of really fun, quick ways that I take little breaks from my day to reflect on what's going on. Next slide, please. And here's another example. I have said everything I think about the index card comics, but this one I made about myself and my husband, Johnny, who often tries to gently tell me that I'm being much too loud, which is something I've been told all my life. So I drew this one and he thought it was funny. Next slide. What's in a Name is a comic that I did publish for the magazine, actually, Inuit Art Quarterly, which is my now full-time job. We had a naming series. You can go to the next slide. We had a naming series in the summer, so I think August to the end of October, possibly. And one of the pieces was a comic that I drew, based on my experience with an Inuktitut name, but also because I was named after my mother's best friend, but also Napatsi Folger, this beautiful, famous Inuit artist. So I based my panels on her artwork, but told the story of my name in this comic. So if you go to the next slide, people can see the comics. We don't have every image of Napatsi Folger's art, but each panel was based on a different piece of art that she's done. And here I messaged my brother and sister for pictures of us as kids, and have my brother's messy hair and ripped jeans there. Little details like that are really fun to include in comics. I think that's one of the things I love the most about comic making, is you can have little inside jokes like that with your family or friends, and it's visually there for them to see. You can go on to the next panel. We're, I think, going a little bit slow here, so if you want to go through them as, yeah, that one's my favorite panel. This, I think, might be one of my favorite comics that I've ever done. I had just gotten a new pen, and it was really crisp and clean, and I also love Napatsi Folger's work a lot, so it turned out really crisp and beautiful, and I liked the story and how it came out. So I was really happy that this was published and that they had asked me to do it for work. And that's the whole thing together. You can also find this online. Marie's going to post the website for Inuit Art Foundation, or you can just Google Inuit Art Foundation and find all of my Inuit art comics on there. But if you go into the chat, I think Marie's put it in there right now. Yes. Okay, next slide. So this is an example of just sort of the process of my comics, and often many people's how they work. This one was another school project, and it was the final project that we had. We had to do, one assignment was doing the 6-page comic in pencils, so our draft. And here you can see my draft. It's messy and smudged. And then if you go to the next panel, this is the final project. This is just the first page. It was a 6-page comic, but you can see the difference is quite a contrast. This project I did, the background is watercolor. I painted it, and then I drew the comics on vellum. So the paper was opaque and you could kind of see the background coming through it, and then glued them down onto the background watercolor pages. So there's quite a difference in the two. And this was at the very last project I did for my MFA. So it was a little bit more advanced than my earlier work, although it was still in the stick figures. So if you go to the next slide. Here is the cover of the last issue of Inuit Art Quarterly, which is a panel from one of my comics, which is also in the magazine. So I'm really proud of this. It's the first time I've ever been on the cover of a magazine, and it turned out really spectacular. It's quite bright and lively. I think the next slide is the full comic. And what I didn't explain earlier about the Inuit art icons in comics is that it was a series that me and Alyssa, who's on this call, and my director, Britt, they knew about me drawing comics and really wanted to encourage me to do some comics for the magazine. So last year, we did the limited series, which is 7 comics about famous Inuit artists. So that's why I'm actually doing this talk, is because one of the artists I did a comic about was Pudlo Pudlat. who is my brother and sister's maternal grandfather. This one is one of the most popular comics that came out of that, and is the one that was printed in the print magazine. And this one is Karu Ashiva. I based each panel on one of his fantastic sculptures. And this one I did sort of just kind of cheeky, what they would talk about if they were, you know, if they were really alive. So if you go on to the next panel, I'll talk about my style development. Next panel, please. This is sort of midway through what I've been working on. So I've always done stick figures. I'm not like a trained artist, so I found that stick figures have always been kind of a fun way to express myself. And I had done this project. This was in my second year of my master's program, and I had gotten storytelling and panel arrangement and stuff down pretty good. And I wanted to start experimenting with how to do things differently in a comic. And the only rules we had for this assignment was that it had to be a four panel comic. So I thought that I would try using my new watercolors and integrate them into this comic, which because I went to a fantastic theater show the week before this called Untitled in Vancouver. I wanted to show the sort of like vastness of it, how big it was and beautiful. So I had the image as if it was one image going across all of the panels and broken up between that. So this is sort of when I started to move away from that basic, here's what happens in this panel, this panel kind of linear movement, into experimenting with comics. So this was a fun move into being more adventurous with my work. If you move to the next one. Here's another example of me sort of changing it up, because I had only ever drawn stick people, and I'd gotten pretty good with facial expressions, even with just a stick person. I got a couple of drawing books, like drawing and painting. One was about how to draw faces, and two of my classmates who are also my friends, we were in a group chat one day after COVID had come out and we had to move on into online classes. We were talking about doing, all introverts, by the way, my two other friends. So we were talking about doing a series of comics as if we, as introverts, moved in with roommates who were all extroverts and wanted to engage us in everything. So this was my version. We were going to do a choose your own adventure, and each of us would do a different version of that comic. So I sent them this, just 3 panels, to show them what I thought it would be like if I had roommates who wanted me to go out and do stuff all the time. You can move to the next panel, please. And this one, I was experimenting. I had just gotten my first ever set of alcohol markers, alcohol-based markers, which are really great and fun to experiment with because you can blend them really well. It's a lot different than using water-based markers. And so I wanted to try something new with color, and also I wanted to try doing a wordless comic, which I had seen some of and thought they were really cool. But as a writer, I am quite dependent on words. So this was a challenge that I wanted to try out, and it was really fun. Also, I don't usually use noses, so that's why you can see a sort of weird white mark in that top corner. Next panel, please. Or sorry, slide. The next 3 slides are sort of the development of one of the other Inuit art icons in comics, just to show you what kind of process I do to get to a final product. I don't, like, often there's several drafts. I'm pretty sure there was another draft before this, probably a few, but here, so it shows the pencil draft. You can see my little tick marks, and then here I had finalized the images, but didn't know what I wanted to do with the colors yet. So I was coloring them different colors. You can see the background in the second panel behind the woman is lighter than behind the little kid. And for this, I had done my final image, but just photocopied it so that I didn't ruin the original, and then tested the colors on this photocopy. And then the next panel is, I believe, the finished copy. We didn't end up going with color except for the background. So we decided that it looked like old prints, the color of the background paper. And I really love this one. This is one of my favorites. This is Helen Kelvek is the artist that this comic is about. And each of those images is almost like her artwork, but I've changed it a little bit. So the first panel is almost exactly like one of her prints, except for she's not drawing a picture in the original real print. I've just adapted that, and I've adapted each panel a little bit differently, but those are images based off of her work. And that's mostly how I did the Inuit art icons in comics, was basing my work on the originals or telling a story using their images. Next panel. So my inspiration is, if you go to the next page, I had a lot of different things inspire me throughout the years. I think just to go earlier than this, I learned to read English very late because I went to school in Inuktitut for the first, up until grade 3. And then we moved to Vancouver and I learned English in the South. So because I loved stories, but I couldn't read yet, my dad got me a lot of Donald Duck and Scrooge McDuck comics. So I've always really liked stories that you could follow without necessarily being able to read. And then, of course, fell in love with comics once I could read. And years ago, before I even considered doing master's in fine arts, I had taken an English course in graphic novels, but we were reading them. And Alison Bechdel's Fun Home was the first graphic novel I had read. And it's a nonfiction story about her and her father, and his, just a very emotional nonfiction story about somebody and their life struggles. And I thought that it was such a beautiful story and such a fantastic way to tell something so private. It shocked me how simple her drawings were, but how much they told. And this is an example of just the intimacy that you can glean from having an image with text like this. My mother must have bathed me hundreds of times, but it's my father rinsing me off with the purple metal cup that I remember the most clearly. And that sentence can be strong on its own if it was in a book, but I think just having the visual makes it so much more of a strong kind of sense of memory here. And that is infused throughout her whole book, and that really stuck with me for years. And to this day, Fun Home is still one of my favorite graphic novels. Next page. I also really liked, sorry, I keep clicking my pen, you can probably hear it. I also really liked that Alison Bechdel, she wrote this before we had all of the access to, you know, Google images and stuff like that. So she took pictures of herself and drew them like as her father. I guess she kind of looks like her father too. So she posed so that she could draw the pictures in that she wanted to include in her comic. If you go on to the next slide, I also did that. And you can see here, I had my partner take a lot of ridiculous pictures of me posing for the, on the left is a page from my thesis. And my story is about a girl who dies and turns into a spirit. And she's turned into a spirit by Nuliayuk, who is the goddess of the sea in Inuit mythology. And I wanted to have her in these top 4 panels, sort of like swimming and beckoning. But it's hard to Google that kind of image. So I had Johnny take this picture of me on our couch, looking like I was, you know, swimming, kind of, I guess. Next panel. Another huge inspiration of mine has been Kate Beaton. This was before, I think even before I went to university the first time. So I hadn't read any graphic novels yet, but I did really like Kate Beaton's comics. She has a website called Hark a Vagrant. It's no longer active, but it's up, it's archived. And she has hundreds and hundreds of comics like this. What I really liked about her work is she was a historian, or is, I guess, a historian, and an English major, which is what I studied in university. And she balanced sort of this funny sense of humor with historical and literary references. So I really, really liked her work because she told these stories about, you know, famous, regal, historical characters and people, but with a sort of sassy, modern point of view about it. This one I liked specifically because it's kind of a jab at how difficult women scientists had it and probably still have it. And you can go to the next slide. There's another Kate Beaton series of comics that I thought was really funny. I had to imitate a panel of comic for one of my comics classes, and I drew the bottom left panel, this baby is a traitor. Because she also calls to mind how ridiculous certain things in history were, like how weird and messed up the French Revolution was. She talks about that a lot in some of her comics. So I think I love the work of Alison Bechdel, but I'm probably more closely associate with Kate Beaton because I tend to move more towards the comedic side of comics. Next panel, please. One of my earliest inspirations in graphic novels and actually being a comic artist was Art Spiegelman, because I read Mouse early on when I was studying comics as well, which is the story of his, so Art Spiegelman is a comic artist who is Jewish, and his father was in one of the concentration camps during World War II. So Mouse is the story of his father telling him about that experience of what it was like. And to lighten it, I don't know if lighten's the right word, but he drew the Jewish people as mice and the Nazis as cats, and various other races and kinds of people are different kinds of animals. And so his work really stood out to me, just the starkness and how raw it was, but how he was able to bring a little bit of levity to it and metaphor using that cat and mouse, and just the texture of his drawing has really drawn me in, particularly for my future work and for my thesis, is because there are a lot of dark themes in the stuff that I do. Not necessarily what I've showed you, but in my writing and in my future graphic novel, there's a lot of heavy elements in it. Next slide, please. So you can see here, he has a lot of dark lines and captures just the fear and tone of what he's doing, while also maintaining a sort of sense of traditional comics, like the old the comics he would have read in the 60s and 70s, with the lines, and the big, on the third panel you can see slam written in big letters, that kind of thing. I like how he's blended those elements, and that's really always impressed me about his work. Next slide, please. And so I guess I will come to the reason I have been invited to talk here about comics today was the comic I did for the Inuit Art Quarterly online. I think this was my 5th comic, the Pudlo Pudlat comic. It's a very personal comic for me, if you go to the next slide, because Pudlo Pudlat, though not my grandfather, he is the grandfather of my brother and sister, who we have different mothers. And so we had this portrait in our house growing up, and I had seen his art regularly. You can go to the next slide. And he was sort of a gateway into Inuit art for me as a kid, because, you know, he was in our family and we got to see his work all the time. You can go to the next slide. So this comic was really fun to do because there are a lot of pieces of his art that I am familiar with and have always loved. This one in particular, I always thought was really cool, just because when you're a little kid, you don't think about, you know, adults and teachers and all those people being kids themselves. So this one was fun to do because I loved this image. And the next panel. I also love this one. It was also really fun because I just like doing color in comics when the rest of the comic isn't usually in color. Plus just that huge fish always makes me so happy. Next panel. And we can see behind Marie there that she has this print too. My brother actually did a short stop motion and used this image too. That's why I wanted to include it particularly in this comic, as just a little call out to my brother, his the big lemming. And it's a really cool, creepy print. Next panel. And then, yeah, he did inspire me, his work and other Inuit artists when I was a kid, because my dad was also always very supportive of art and becoming an artist. So this is a picture. On the right is an actual picture of a drawing that I did for my dad. And so I used that as a reference for the last panel in the comic, of me, of course, being a cheeky little brat. And if you go to the next panel, you can see the whole thing, comic altogether. So this was a really fun comic to do because I got to think about my actual life, whereas the other comics, which were also fun, but I didn't know any of the artists personally, and I wasn't necessarily familiar with their work as a kid. So this one was really fun to do and sort of insert myself into the work, which I haven't done for any of the previous comics in the series. Next print. Yeah, so like before, I just thought I'd include the draft that I did before the final comic. You can see in that last panel, like part of the process of doing drafts is realizing, oh, there's too many words here to fit in this panel. So it comes out of the panel, and how kind of it's good to do drafts if you want to do like a final project or something nice, a present for a friend or family. It's always good to map something out in a rough sketch like this beforehand. And yeah, you can go on to the next panel, I think. Oh, there's no more. Okay. Yeah, I have gone through everything, I think. If you have questions, I would love to answer them.
I certainly always have questions. Thank you, Napatsi. I will, you know, the chat is open for your questions, so go ahead. But in the meantime, I certainly have a question for you.
Okay.
You have said during your talk that you are like the aspect of the comic as a, you know, something to make us laugh sometimes. But in your master, you also are treating about heavy stuff. So how do you combine both in a comic?
It really depends. Like, that's part of the art of comic making, I think, is being able to balance the two. It's interesting because that was one of the things I talked about in my thesis defense was one of the things that I struggle with as a writer is dealing with heavy emotional topics right away. So I tend to do more comic or funny content to push off not having to deal with emotional things in my writing. And then I have to edit it afterwards. And that's what happened in my thesis. Was the first 4 chapters, I was like, oh, this is so funny. She's going to be doing this. This is so funny. And then my professor and supervisor told me, this is all great, but she just died. So she should probably deal with the emotions of being dead. And I was like, oh yeah, okay. So it's interesting, because that is a really difficult thing to do. And it takes practice. And I think one of the things people don't think about when they're new at something and not necessarily, like, they don't feel confident about their work is, no matter how good at something, drawing, writing, whatever you're going to do, you should always realize that you're going to need to edit at some point. Nothing ever comes out perfect, even from the best writers. And I know that now more than ever, both from doing my first novel, doing a master's in creative writing, and also being an editor now for a magazine, is there's always going to be changes that have to be made. And especially if you're trying to balance between levity in like comedic aspects of a heavy storyline, sometimes you don't have to be funny in a heavy story. That's how I tend to work, but it's a tough balance. And I think the key to it is subtlety and sensitivity to the reader and to the characters. One of the things that my supervisor told me was that she loved how sensitive I was to my characters. It was as though, like, treat them like they're people, like they're your family. So, you know, awful things are happening, but respect who you're drawing and who you're writing about as if they're a real person, and know things about them that you're not necessarily showing and writing, but that you wish people would be careful about if you were in that position as a main character in something.
You have to think for more than yourself. It's a very interesting, like, you have to be involved in the head of so many people while creating something. Mm-hmm. And I liked a lot your comics about What's in the Name. Also, I had the impression it was inspired by some, you know, actual event that occurred in your life. Am I wrong?
No, that's true. It's a true comic. Most of my comics are nonfiction based on my life. And for the Inuit art icons and comics, they're not necessarily true events, but they're based on information that I read about about the artists. But yeah, usually when I'm doing comics, especially if it's about me, then it's true. And those specific panels for What's in a Name were basically true. Like, I didn't draw the like racist characters as who they really were, but those things happened to me, you know. Like, I worked with a guy who told me he wanted to scalp me, or you better not scalp me. And people always said weird stuff about my name when I was growing up, because I grew up in Vancouver. I mean, after I left Iqaluit when I was 8. And then I did feel those things when I moved back to Iqaluit, and was really happy. And it was very emotional too. I didn't even realize how much of an impact that stuff had until I went back to Iqaluit. So yeah, so those are based on true events, and more or less did happen.
Thank you so much for answering. And I have a question for you here. It's Jamie Hine saying, the emotional connection in your work is very touching. You have talked and showed comics about family and artists, groups with deep connections to your life as inspirations for your comic. I appreciate the emotional connection as an important aspect of your creative process. So that's a nice appreciation.
I find that's the best kind of content for me. Not necessarily everybody, but that's where my best work has come from, is stuff that I'm emotionally connected to. I have tried to do fiction stuff, but I find that the best fiction comes from, you know, pulling elements of emotional things that have happened to me. Maybe not the events that I write about, but thinking about stuff that's happened to me and how it made me feel, and then applying those emotions into my fiction. And other than that, like, I can't write fantasy that well. I'm just not imaginative enough.
No, I think you are very imaginative. You cannot discredit yourself here. And I really felt the real, you know, when I read your comics, like the What's in the Name, for instance. I really, and I felt it. I saw it. There's another question here. Alison Hardwick, what advice would you give to folks interested in trying to write and draw comics? It's a good one.
Do it all the time. So anybody, like, as you can see from my comics, the early comics, they're just very basic, simple stick people. And practicing it, I think one of the most fun things about my stick comics that when I first started out doing them was, you know, you have to, it's a stick person, so you have to be very basic. So you have to get exaggerated expressions down pretty good. And it's really fun to go in the mirror and be like, okay, I want this person to be quizzical. So you're just looking at yourself like making ridiculous faces, and be ready to do that. And you can make comics about anything. That's what's really nice about it is, and Allison, who I happen to work with, I know that she's an excellent photographer. I think it's great to look at photography and just the layout of beautiful images to frame how you're going to do panels, which is really nice. Some of the most beautiful comics I've seen are just beautifully laid out, and each panel looks like a photograph the way it's framed, and just like rule of thirds, that kind of stuff. So it depends on who you are and what you want to accomplish, but lean into your skill and experiment and draw comics every day, even just little crummy 2-panel index card comics. They're fun, and it relaxes you, and you know, you can do a bad, not funny, not good comic, but as long as you're doing them, if you want to get better, practice every day and just doodle.
Practice makes perfect, right? That's how you do it. And I want to know about the fact that, you know, in several of the comics that you did, one of the, you know, Napatsi Folger reference, and also Pudlo Pudlat, there were some very intricate details there, and it was like very like an artwork itself in the comic. But you also managed to include the stick figure, you know, and the expression of the official, and it's like it's a whole. How long has it been for you to be able to manage all these different type of like drawings and fit it in you know, a square so that it works?
That is a good question. It took me a while to get to that point. I had always done stick figures earlier, just like for birthday cards or whatever, just for fun. And I think like anybody who knows me knows how expressive I am in my face, just generally. So I think I have a pretty good awareness of facial muscles. So I'll make the face when I'm trying to draw it, and I'll feel it like on my face. And so I've been pretty good with the facial expressions, even on my stick people. And then it took me quite a while to be confident enough for the Inuit art comics. And I did, because in my job, I look at a lot of Inuit art. So I got more comfortable like choosing the images I wanted to use for each comic and printing them out and practicing in pencil like over and over to make sure I get it right. So that I actually would print out the size of the image, like the Pudlo Pudlat image that of his photograph. I printed it the size I wanted it to be in my comic panel so that I could get the proportions right when I was drawing it. So for that more intricate stuff, that took a lot more time than my usual comic work because I was copying something else and I wanted to get it right. And I spent a lot more time on those. But yeah, like that's all been more recent. So I have done enough comics over the years to be more comfortable doing that.
I can see that, you know, you spent a lot of time and you were talking to me about that little bird on one of the Pudlo Pudlat, you know, like close to the belt of the wall. The muskox is very intricate. So, and it's just, you know, Nak is the one who showed us your work, and that's how we got to have the chance to have the conference. So I thank her here. I thank you for really doing a great job at this, and I'm thanking everyone for coming in today. And no, really, you do amazing work, and I can't wait to see the next work that you will do for Inuit Art Quarterly. I think they have a great colleague here, and I wish you all the best. Yeah, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
I wish you and everyone a nice evening, and you have a lot of thank you so much coming in. So everyone is thanking you right now. So I wish you all a great evening, and thank you again. Bye-bye.